educational television and radio center.
In the first program of this series, I gave you a rather quick survey of the general field of rocket science and its accomplishments to date. Pretty soon we're going to look into the working principles of rockets. But first, let's look back through time to the birth and infancy of rockets and see how the idea originated and developed. It'll probably surprise many of you to learn that the first record of rocket use dates back farther than that of any other self-propelled device. 1900 saw the first one-cylinder autos chugging through the streets of Europe and America. 1800 witnessed the phenomena of steam power. 1600 saw only the aristocratic coaches of the royalty and primitive farm wagons. 1400 saw many of the communities of the world still struggling with the turning of the wheel. But in 1232, the Mongols, laying siege to the city of Peking, were confronted with this terror. Just how the Chinese discovered the use of the self-propelling fire arrow of this 13th century incident is open to some speculation. It's logical to suppose that they'd stumbled on something very much like gunpowder. The early Greeks discovered that salt added to combustible materials would make the fire burn brighter. But apparently the Chinese refined this formula and substituted saltpeter for salt. Now, all that was needed to make gunpowder was the addition of pulverized charcoal and sulfur. This mixture was successfully demonstrated as an explosive about 32 years before the Peking episode. The Chinese, by the way, dropped bombs from the walls of their city down on the heads of the invading Mongols. Unfortunately for humanity, modern warfare was born. Since history tells us that these Chinese fire arrows were self-propelled, it's possible that their inventors had also run across the notion of jet propulsion. The saltpeter mixture was undoubtedly enclosed in some manner so that a propelling force could be set up and so that the fire could be protected from the wind. When the arrow struck its target, the fire would be dispersed so that the unburned fuel of the propulsion unit also became sort of an incendiary bomb. Although this Peking incident records the first time that a rocket has moved through the air under its own power, there exists a much earlier example of an experiment in jet propulsion. We don't know exactly how the original aeolipile looked, but it probably shaped up something like this. The bowl-shaped container held water, which was boiled and turned into steam by the fire beneath it. The steam rose through the tubes into the spherical chamber and escaped through the crude jet nozzles extending from the ball. A marvelous machine when you consider its age. Its inventor was a Greek named Hero, who lived several centuries before Christ. About 2,000 years after Hero invented this machine, another enterprising physicist struck on the idea of forcing water through the ball instead of steam. The refinement of this idea is seen in action. The common rotating lawn sprinkler. Certainly not a rocket, but very much the same idea. It didn't take long for the Chinese fire arrow to arrive in other parts of the world. About 8 years after the Peking incident, the fire arrow turned up in Arabia. And history produces for us written documents from this ancient country that explain how saltpeter can be mixed with charcoal and sulfur to produce rocket powder. And in 1258, we're told that rockets were used in a battle at Cologne. A decisive battle is won by the use of rockets on the Isle of Chiozza, off the coast of Italy in 1379. But by 1313, a new instrument of warfare has been invented. An instrument that could project a missile with more force and more accuracy than the rocket. The gun. The magic formula of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur had been perfected into gunpowder, and the age of firearms arrived. Through the Middle Ages, firearms were improved in force and accuracy, and generally won favor over the less controllable rockets. The rocket, in turn, became a popular weapon at sea. The old war galleys and sailing vessels were highly inflammable targets, with their wood and pitch construction. It's reported that pirates first got the hang of the idea. The vessels that were preyed upon were soon fighting back in kind, and many spectacular rocket battles at sea punctuated naval history in the 16th and 17th centuries. And while the rockets lit up the battle sky, the principle was by no means neglected by ingenious, if not eccentric, onlookers. Consider the Chinese gentleman, Wan Hu. In about 1500, he decided to inaugurate rocket travel by means of this rather problematical contraption made of 2 kites and a saddle. The suicidal contraption was completed by the attachment of 47 powder rockets to the kites, to be lit by 47 coolies who stood by with torches. And so we say goodbye to Wan Hu, but the idea certainly lived on after him. There were dreamers in Europe, too. The Italian military engineer, Jones de Fontana, completed a sketchbook of operational rockets in 1420. Among his designs were this rocket torpedo designed to travel across water, disguised as a sea monster, and this rocket car which traveled on wooden rollers. Even in the Middle Ages, the imagination of man had been struck by the possibility of the rocket as a vehicle. Although the rocket became a popular novelty during the 18th century, very little was done to improve it until it suddenly reappeared on the military scene around 1800. Reports reached England that the British cavalry in India had been confronted and badly set back by the rocket gunners of the Prince of Mysore. Using a corps of 5,000 men, the Prince directed rockets of this design against the unfortunate British. An iron tube contained the charge, and the missile weighed up to 12 pounds. An unusual new device had been added, a 10-foot bamboo pole to serve as a balance and guiding mechanism. The rockets had a range of 1 mile to 1.5 miles and were reasonably effective, especially when they were fired in great numbers. The simple addition of the bamboo pole to the rocket was the first step forward to controlled flight. For the first time, a gun crew could be reasonably sure that the rocket would go in the proper direction. A British colonel, William Congreve, quickly seized on this new notion and developed war rockets that were to make impressive records in British campaigns in Europe in the early 19th century. British artillerymen condemned the Congreve rockets as impractical and not dependable. But a British rocket barrage created a devastating fire in Boulogne in 1806. A huge attack by 25,000 rockets destroyed the greater part of Copenhagen in 1807. Danzig was severely damaged by British rockets in the fall of 1813. And the British Rocket Corps figured materially in the winning of the Battle of Leipzig, which broke Napoleon's power in Europe. The Congreve rocket made its imprint on American history during the bombardment of Fort McHenry in September 1814. 3 weeks earlier, the British rocket troops had turned the American flank at the Battle of Bladensburg, thus opening the way for the capture and burning of Washington. But it was the spectacular attack at Fort McHenry that gave us one line of our national anthem. The rocket's red glare the bombs bursting in air was Francis Scott Key's description of the rockets that struck at the bastions of this famous fort. After Congreve, the only significant advancement in the war rocket was made by another Britisher, William Hale. He devised a stickless rocket which was stabilized by rotation, set up by 3 slightly inclined metal vanes in the exhaust nozzle, another forerunner of one of the modern control systems. The Hale rocket was used briefly by the United States Army, but toward the end of the 19th century, rocket warfare rapidly began to fade away in the face of rapid developments in artillery. Until the tremendous resurgence of rockets as military weapons in World War II, the science went to sea again and made its most notable contributions in life-saving. The Congreve rocket was adapted to line throwing between disabled vessels and the shore to effect rescue. In looking through the history of almost any science, we're likely to find that very simple and fundamental discoveries are necessary to throw light into the wilderness. Sir Isaac Newton formulated the law of gravity, possibly not in such a historically addle-pated way, but as he continued along his line of logic and discovery, he hit upon the basic tenet of rocketry, the third law of motion. Every action is accompanied by an equal but opposite reaction. After this statement of the law, physicists began to understand that rocket motion did not depend on some unknown force of gunpowder. Instead, it depended on the successful production of an exhaust. A Dutch professor, Jacob William Scravesande, dreamed up this steam reaction car about 1720. Some people say he actually built a model that moved under its own power. And there were other dream vehicles, some sound and some foolish, but all proving that man was becoming fascinated with the notion of traveling in the air. The idea of a rocket airplane such as this came out of Germany in about 1850. A model of this steam reaction helicopter actually worked in Paris in 1860. This surprisingly modern jet steam aircraft, with its vertical swept-back fin, was projected in 1867. And this rocket airship was a serious project of 1893. And so we've quickly surveyed the actualities and dreams of rocketry up to the 20th century. As you've seen, the idea went through many forms, some successful and some not. Some were ingenious and some ludicrous. But they all paved the way for the astounding developments of the last 25 years. We'll talk about these in our next meeting. See you then.
The preceding program was produced for the education. This is National Educational Television.